So, trades and occupations in the biblical world, and we have a few more of this kind of thing that we're going to be doing over the next few weeks too. So, we've talked about some of this, some at length, some not so much. Obviously, farming was among the premier occupations of the ancient world. Crop yields were not like they are today, where a single acre can yield X number of bushels. In the ancient world, they were productive. They were obviously using only natural materials, only natural fertilizers, not phosphates and nitrogen and like that. But nonetheless, it was a lot of hard work, and the entire world depended on especially cereal grains. So wheat, barley, rye, sometimes spelt and like that. But cereal grains were really, literally the staff of life. If you had a snack, if you had some dried meat or dried fish, or you had some fruit, that's a snack. If you eat it with a bread product, that's a meal. So the bread is kind of the core thing. And in a meal, you'd have your bread quite often. You'd tear off a chunk. For the Jews, it was abhorrent to use a knife on bread. You always broke it with your hands. So you didn't cut it, you broke it. And then you'd use your broken piece of bread to dip it into a sauce. And at a dinner party, there'd be kind of a central, you know, like Lazy Susan. I don't think they had Lazy Susans, but you'd have sauces in little containers, and you could dip your bread into a variety of herb sauces and like that. So farmer, shepherd, herdsman, fisherman, orchard keeper, vineyard dresser, olive grove tender, and an olive press operator, bread baker. A bread baker in a large town or village, there might be a central oven in the village square where bread was baked fresh daily. But in a smaller setting, it would be the wife of the household who would have her own oven in her own courtyard. And so there were bakers, especially in cities and so on. It simply wasn't convenient for every single household to have its own oven. So bread baking was an occupation. Textiles and pottery and so on. Tanner, what's a tanner? Skins and hides. Wool comber, weaver, dyer. So those all have to do with wool that you're getting from sheep and goats, and processing it, spinning it into yarn, and then if you're going to dye it, you're going to treat it so it's got some color, and then weaving, so on. Those are all dealing with what's going to become fabric. So it all has to be done by hand. A seamstress makes the fabric. A fuller is somebody who treats the wool and washes it. Tent maker, potter, smith, both in bronze and iron. The rough cutoff date, by the way, between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age is around 1200 or 1000 BC. So in the Middle East, it's usually considered to be around 1000 BC. In Europe, a little bit earlier. Merchants and innkeepers, and the building trades, a stone cutter, so that's the guy who works in the quarry. How would they split sandstone or limestone? They did work a little bit with granite and marble, especially in places other than Israel, but nonetheless, all these stones have to be handled in a certain way. How do they cut a 1-ton block of stone from a quarry wall? So the same basic techniques that have been used right here in the Mount Washington Valley, going back 200-300 years, redstone quarry, they would drill a series of holes. Now they didn't have power equipment, so those holes were drilled by hand, and then you would drive in a wedge that has 3 parts to it, made of wood. The wedge is made of wood. And then you would sprinkle water or pour water onto those pins in a straight line. So these holes are drilled in a straight line, and then you pour water on it, and then you wait. What happens? The water expands the wood, and it splits it on that line. And the stone just drops away. So that technique is ancient, ancient, ancient. A stonemason is the guy who's at the building site, and he's going to dress and fit the stone into its final form in a wall. Carpenter, working with wood brickmaker, could be fired or unfired, and unfired it might be clay, or it might be actually mud brick that is made out of dirt with a little bit of clay in it, and then it's got to have a binding agent, otherwise it just dissolves back into mud. The binding agent is going to be chaff or straw, and then a shipwright, and all of these would have subdivisions too. So, a chariot wright is somebody who makes chariots. A shipwright might have different specialties in the shipyard. Government official, so I suspect even in 1000 BC, people on the street were saying, I wish we had limited government. The government bureaucracy just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And probably that's true. They had scribes, they had runners, elders, and judges. In the Roman world, they had proconsul, procurator, governor, tax collectors, customs officials, soldiers, jailers, and more besides. Musicians. So, and we know this from the book of Psalms and from a narrative about David's setting up of temple music program. Choir director, professional musicians, minstrels. So they did have something like that. It doesn't get a lot of coverage in the Bible, but there were actually traveling musicians, and they would tell stories by means of their music. They would introduce one village to a song that this guy had heard down in the southern part of Israel, whatever. Levitical musicians. So some of this, again, is redundant. We talked about olive production. So this is how you harvest olives. You have giant tarps that you spread out on the ground, and then you beat the trees with a long stick. Olive trees are not normally very, very tall, very big. So you beat the tree, and it begins to rain olives, and then you collect them all, and then you bag them up. And it's a real art form to get the olives at the right stage of ripeness so that you can get them off the trees, but that the oil that is produced has a good flavor. You don't want to wait too long, but you don't want to wait too little either. So here's a guy, I think this is North Africa maybe, who is putting olives into a burlap bag. So we talked about the olive press. There's two forms of presses that we know about from biblical territories. So you can see there is this long wooden lever. It's fixed here, it's in the wall. And over here you've got ropes and stone weights. So those stones have holes drilled in them so you can put the rope through it. And you're going to put all this weight at this end, and then it's going to press down on this stone, and here is the basket that has been filled with olives. So it's just squeezing this basket, and the olive oil is running out here, and underground there's a catch basin. So under the ground there's a big vat that's going to collect all the olive oil, and then normally they'd build it on a slope, and farther downhill is the outlet to collect the oil coming out of that. You would run it through a cheesecloth, some kind of a sieve, to get any leaves or any debris that might be in it, and then you're going to process it further. By the way, this same technique is used in Europe and I think in North America for cider. So something like this. Now, in the modern day, an invention happened, we don't know when, that is a major, major part of our industrialization, the screw. So many, many modern machines, including cider presses and like that, have a screw mechanism where you can apply a lot of force with levers, screwing down like a book press or a cider press or an olive press. Here's another kind of olive press. This one is donkey powered. And so here's a central axis, this log goes through a hole here, and the donkey is attached to that, and he's going to walk around and around, and you dump your olives in here, and this large stone, which is angled just a little bit, is going to squash the olives. And normally you would press the olives once, and the first pressing was considered the nicest, the best, and that would be high quality, higher price. You could take the olives that have been squashed and put them back in and get a second pressing, and that's not as nice. That's not as flavorful and not as pure, I suppose. You can sometimes do that like 3 times, try to get every last drop out of it that you could. At the end of that, you would then feed the pulp that's left over to your animals. So that turns into fodder, so you're not wasting anything. We talked a while ago about amphora, and amphora is a single pottery jar, and it's just the most bizarre shape, but this is found all over the ancient world for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And there is some variety. You can see the different kinds off to the right. Some very narrow and skinny, some with lower capacity volume, and others with higher capacity. But this is an amphora, the plural is amphorae. And it's used for olive oil, it's used for various kinds of liquids, it's used for grape juice, it's used for wine, it's used for any liquid content. And at the top, right there, if they were going to transport olive oil or whatever, like this scale model of a ship, so this is a life-size model cutaway of the hull of a transport ship. So you can see here's the hull of the vessel, here's a rib, and this is the cargo hold, and you have these amphorae, hundreds and hundreds, lined up against each other, and they're kind of held in place by the bulk of them, and there is some padding, some filler here to keep them from shifting, keep them from tipping over. But if you're going to transport olive oil, say from Ekron on the Gaza Strip of Eastern Mediterranean to Rome, how would you keep it fresh? That's 800 miles or something. It's going to take a while to get there. How would you keep it fresh? You pour wax across the top. You seal it. This is not paraffin. This is beeswax. So you melt the wax, you pour it across the top, and it forms a perfect seal. So it's anaerobic. There's no oxygen can get in there, and you have grape juice or olive oil kept sealed, and they would actually pour it onto the top layer of liquid. So it's actually in contact. There's no head space with oxygen in there. It can actually keep fresh for years and years and years. As long as you don't puncture that seal, it's going to last a long, long time. So here's fishing, and fishing obviously plays a major role in the New Testament and the Gospels in particular. There are several kinds of fishing styles. Ancient peoples did know how to do angling with a hook and a line. They could, and they did do that, and actually ancient hooks have been found in Israel and elsewhere. But commercial fishing is not done with a hook and a line. It's done with a net. So here's dragnet fishing, and you can see you need 2 parties. You cast or walk the net out into the water, and one set of guys holds this line, another set of guys holds this line, and then they simply pull it to shore, and they're trapping the fish in the bite. And this same technique can be used between ships. You can actually have 2 ships, and one ship is holding one end of the line, and another boat is holding the other end. And this was used a lot in the Sea of Galilee. So here's a little different kind of fishing. So this is a single guy with a smaller net. This is called a draw net. And you can see a little bit here. It's a circular net. Here's the edge of it, and the edge has weights sewn onto it. And when it gets tossed in the water, it becomes kind of cone-shaped. And at the top of the cone, there's a single line, so it's going to look something like this. And he holds that single line. Can you picture what's going to happen? It circles out into a round shape. It drops into the water. The weights carry it down into the water. And then what happens is he pulls the line up. It cinches up, it grabs, and so he's got a bunch of fish inside of it. In the 1980s, I think it was, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, it was a really, really bad 4, 5, 6 years of drought, and the level of the Sea of Galilee dropped by several feet. And a couple of Israelis walking along the shore by a kibbutz discovered wood sticking out of the water, and they recognized quickly it's a boat, and it's been underwater for who knows how long, and this became very, very famous. They actually put together a major operation to preserve it. The wood was so fragile, they actually had to use something like expanding foam insulation inside and outside to keep it from just disintegrating. And then they got it up, and they built a special tank. They put it in the tank for several years with polyethylene glycol to preserve it. And today it's in a museum. This is the Boat of Magadan. And this is an Israeli fishing vessel from the Sea of Galilee that dates to the time of Jesus. It likely was used in the 67 to 70 Jewish war because they discovered actually that there were arrowheads embedded in the gunnels. And there was actually naval action on the Sea of Galilee between the Romans and the Jews. But it's about 28 feet long, about 7.5 feet wide, and from gunwale to keel, something like 4.5, 5 feet. So not a big vessel. Some others, we think, I can't remember if this one has it or not, were fitted with a socket for a mast so that you could put a sail up. Primary propulsion would have been oars. So this is a very authentic. They actually did a reconstruction, and that's what it looks like. So it did have a mast. So that's a very authentic reproduction of a fishing vessel on the Sea of Galilee from the time of Christ. It does, yeah, I noticed that too. The front end and the back end have that curved bow and stern piece that make it a little bit Scandinavian looking. We don't have a lot in the Bible about this, but we do have references to overland travel. So an innkeeper or a caravansery administrator was an important position. So a caravansery is a place walled where a caravan overland route can stop and rest overnight. You can see it's got a fountain or a cistern, and the courtyard would be for animals, and the porticos on the sides would be for people. You could probably impromptu set up shop, set up your wares and try to sell stuff too, but there'd also be a lot of trading and dealing and bargaining going on. But in dry, arid country, this would be where you'd stop for security and rest. And there'd be, it'd be like an inn, so you get charged for you, how many animals do you have, and like that. And it'd also have feed or fodder for your animals. Here's a cross-section of an ancient caravansery. You can see the courtyard on the bottom, that section of it. You can see that there's a large courtyard and areas all around with a gate. So there was a well-developed road net in the ancient Middle East from before Abraham's day. We talked about this a while ago. Caravans traveled from Egypt to Damascus and points north and east from there and vice versa. Spices and other exotic consumables came from the southern parts of Arabia, India, and as far as China. Caravans, along with some seaborne transport, were the main channel for import-export operations. They were the equivalent of today's railways and tractor trailers. So this is how bulk commodities traveled. Here's a modern day caravan. So jobs, camel drivers, donkey drivers, merchants or agents, sometimes, not always, security guards. I've always been fascinated with thinking about how advanced was the trade network and the trade culture in Bible days. And I pointed this out a few weeks ago. In Ezekiel, we twice have references to silk. Why is that interesting? China, there's a connection to China. And so the Silk Road is an ancient, it's not a single road. It's a net of roads that stretches from China and even Indonesia, all the way overland through India and through what today would be Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, and all the way to the Middle East, and from there into Europe. And parts of it could be over water too. So the blue represents sea routes. But think about it, you know, in Ezekiel's day, which is like, 500, 550 or so BC, silk was getting transported from China all the way to the Middle East. So we're turning to building trades for a minute. Modern mud brick making is nearly identical to its ancient predecessor. You can see this guy has a wooden mold right here. And he's got water and he's got clay or dirt, and they're slobbering the wet clay and dirt into the mold, and then you just loosen it up, lift it up, set it down, and make another one. And it's drying in the sun. Here's a stone quarry, and you can see it's been worked pretty thoroughly. So all of those blocks of stone have been cut out by hand or by splitting, as we discussed earlier. When it gets to the building site, a stonemason is going to use a mallet and chisels to dress the stone into the proper shape and then fit it into a building project. Oops, that's out of place. A carpenter. Now, when we think carpenter, we're thinking somebody who builds a house. That's not quite right, probably. Why isn't it quite right to think in our minds, carpenter, oh, that's a guy who builds a house. In Bible days, what did you make a house out of? Mud bricks. You don't need a carpenter for that. You do it. You make your own house. You make the mud bricks we saw just a minute ago. You get some straw from the wheat fields, you mix it in with clay and dirt, get it wet, make a mold, and then you lay it up. And you just keep adding course after course. Possibly you would hire a carpenter when it came time to put the roof on. The roof is generally a flat roof. It might have just a little pitch to it, just a little angle, it might not. But the way a roof works is you have larger beams, tree trunks or very large branches, and it's possible you would hire a carpenter to dress those beams. What do I mean by dress? Prep them, get them squared up, get some of the knots, get the bark off, so kind of dress it like an old New England timber frame home where you'd see a squared timber. So they might be hired to dress up big timber, and the timbers go this way, and then on top of those main carrying beams would be smaller branches going perpendicular. And then another one, smaller branches going the other way, and maybe another one. Well, right now you just got kind of a thatch roof and it's not waterproof. What do you do next? Mud, more mud. And you've got grass and rushes or reeds or canes, and you've got hay, and you're gonna put the mud on, let it dry, put another layer of mud on, let it dry. In the springtime, after the first rains, every spring you would check for leaks, or maybe you wouldn't have to check. You would just know. We have a major leak here, we have a big leak over there, here's a little one here. And so part of the chores of the man of the house was every spring you get up on the roof with a big bucket of mud and you slather more on, and then you roll it with a roller. So a carpenter was not really a house builder. What did he do? Well, he made farm implements like plows, carts, winnowing forks. He might have dressed beams for house roofs, possibly made doors for houses. Possibly he made some basic furniture like stools, chests. Joinery technique was mortise and tenon, loose splines, bronze nails. So ancient biblical homes didn't really have chairs, tables, dressers, beds. They didn't really have that. You sat on the floor, you had cushions that you leaned on. You know, if you were resting in your house, even if you had dinner guests over, you didn't normally sit at a table. You didn't have a table. You would recline on your elbow. You'd have maybe a low table, maybe no table at all. A low table is maybe like 4 or 6 inches off the floor. You put your food on that and you recline on your left side. And you eat with your right hand. You never touch food with your left hand. Always your right hand. And you recline around the table. So the carpenter is not making chairs. He's not making bedsteads. He's not making wardrobes. Maybe a chest, maybe not. But that's a carpenter. So, can you see a couple of tools? This is a Roman frieze, a Roman carving. What's that? It's a frame saw. So you've got a wooden frame with a saw blade, and the saw blade, probably bronze, or if it's Roman, it was probably iron. But the saw blade is held in tension by the frame. Frame saws are still around today, by the way. Those are still legit tools. And this, I'm not sure what that is. It's possible it's part of the frame saw. And if it is, if that frame saw has a big beam over it attached to it, that's actually a pit saw. And pit saws are famous in our territory, New England, because the first colonials, the first settlers, used pit saws for sawing beams and boards out of logs. You'd have one guy down in a pit and the other guy standing on the log with a frame saw, and they're going to do this all day long. And you would, if you're throwing dice to choose which is which, you always hope that you're the top guy. Can you guess why? Because the bottom guy eats sawdust all day long. So, and then over here, you know what those are. Those are planes. Those are wood planes. Those are Roman specifically, and they look almost identical to planes that we would have today. So for just a couple minutes, go to Isaiah 44. Isaiah 44. I mentioned in our opening time that the places where we learn the most about tools and techniques of woodworking is sadly in places where idolatry, idol figures are being manufactured. And here's one of the premier ones, Isaiah 44. I'm going to start in verse 9. Those who fashion a graven image are all of them futile, and their precious things are of no profit. Even their own witnesses fail to see or know, so that they will be put to shame. Who has fashioned a god or cast an idol to no profit? Behold, all his companions will be put to shame, for the craftsmen themselves are mere men. Let them all assemble themselves, let them stand up, let them tremble, let them together be put to shame. The man shapes iron into a cutting tool and does his work over the coals, fashioning it with hammers and working it with his strong arm. He also gets hungry and his strength fails. He drinks no water and becomes weary. Another shapes wood. He extends a measuring line. He outlines it with red chalk. He works it with planes and outlines it with a compass, and makes it like the form of a man, like the beauty of a man, so that it may sit in a house. Surely he cuts cedars for himself and takes a cypress or an oak and raises it for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a fir, and the rain makes it grow. Then it becomes something for man to burn, so he takes one of them and warms himself. He also makes a fire to bake bread. He also makes a god and worships it. He makes it a graven image and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over this half he eats meat as he roasts a roast and is satisfied. He also warms himself and says, "Aha, I am warm, I have seen the fire." But the rest of it he makes into a god, his graven image. He falls down before it and worships. He also prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." They do not know, nor do they understand, for he has smeared over their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so that they cannot comprehend. No one recalls, nor is there knowledge or understanding to say, "I have burned half of it in the fire, and also have baked bread over its coals. I roast meat and eat it. Then I make the rest of it into an abomination. I fall down before a block of wood." So you can see, God through Isaiah is using a lot of irony, even sarcasm, to paint a picture here of somebody who, he goes out in the woods and he sees a really nice tree. He said, "Boy, I like that tree. That's a beautiful tree." So he cuts it down and he drags it back to his house. And he finds the best part of it and says, "I'm going to turn this into a god. This is going to be my god." And so he uses all his skills as a woodworker. He outlines it, he carves it out, he uses his best tools, and he spends a lot of time. He gets tired and thirsty. He had to hire a blacksmith to make the tools that he's using. And the whole thing is the product of his own hands. The whole thing is what he made. He designed it. He's cutting it out. And in fact, partway through, he says, "Man, am I hungry." And so he takes the other half of the log and throws it in the fire. And it's kind of a chilly day, so he warms his hands. And then he says to his wife, "Hey, could you bake some bread? I'm starving." And that wood was burned up to make a meal for him. The other half of the same log is now his God. Go to Jeremiah chapter 10. The whole chapter, nearly the whole chapter, is another one of these ironic passages talking about the processes used to fabricate an idol. And pick it up in verse 1. Jeremiah 10:1. "Hear the word of the Lord, which the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, do not learn the way of the nations. Do not be terrified by the signs of the heavens." So this would be like astrology. People see certain configurations and they look on and say, "Oh no, it's going to be a really bad year," or something terrible is going to happen. So this is like astrology. "Although the nations are terrified by them, for the customs of the people are delusion, because it is wood cut from the forest, the work of the hands of a craftsman with a cutting tool. They decorate it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not totter." So what do they have to do after they've made this idol out of wood? Well, they got to nail it to the mantle, because they look at it one day and the kids are running through the house and the god is wobbling back and forth on the mantelpiece. It's, "Oh no, if that were to fall, it would break or get its nose smashed off. I'll nail it down." And then, of course, you bow down to your God and you pray to it and say, "Oh God, deliver us, help us." But you're always keeping an eye out, because it's a pretty nice idol, and if your neighbors see it, they might steal it. So you kind of guard it. You got to protect it. But then you bow down and you pray to it. And this chapter is saying, what fools, what stupidity. You don't even think, you're not thinking straight to think that a chunk of wood or a glob of gold or a chunk of bronze is anything worthwhile. It never did anything for you. It can't hear you. It's not alive. It is nothing. It's the work of your hands. and you're not thinking straight, to ponder that you're praying to an inanimate object. And so this goes on for the whole chapter, really. We'll read a little bit more. Look at verse 6. There is none like you, O Lord. You are great, and great is your name and might. Who would not fear you, O King of the nations? Indeed, it is your due, for among all the wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like you. But they are altogether stupid and foolish in their discipline of delusion. Their idol is wood. Beaten silver is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uthaz, the work of a craftsman and of the hands of a goldsmith. Violet and purple are their clothing. They are all the work of skilled men. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and the everlasting King. At his wrath the earth quakes, and the nations cannot endure his indignation. Thus you shall say to them, the gods that did not make the heavens and the earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens. And there's more. And so God says to Jeremiah, tell the people this. The people who are worshiping these gods, those gods are going to perish. They're going to die. And indeed, largely throughout the whole world, gods that were worshipped 2,000, 3,000 years ago have been forgotten. Well, there's only one true and living God, and he is the God of the Bible. Look at one more thing. Go over to Psalm 135. Psalm 135. Start in verse 14. 135:14. For the Lord will judge his people and will have compassion on his servants. The idols of the nations are but silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. Nor is there any breath at all in their mouths. Those who make them will be like them. Yes, everyone who trusts in them. I remember as a kid in public school, the science class and health class and like that, the teachers would say, you are what you eat. I think there's maybe TV commercials like that too. The point was, if you eat Doritos and drink Pepsi and chew bubble gum, eventually what's in that becomes you. You're digesting it, and if it doesn't have any nutritional value, if it doesn't have any supplemental value, what are you becoming? What are you turning your body into? And that's legit, that's an accurate statement. But I'd like to change it from you are what you eat to you are what you worship in this verse. Those who worship these things will become those things. So somebody who worships the almighty dollar, somebody who worships money, they become, as it were, a block of metal. Somebody who worships success, status, you become a mockery of value. So, you worship whatever the world holds out as valuable, as worthwhile. You worship that. You are, over a course of time, you are becoming that. The flip side, of course, would be biblical Christianity. True biblical Christianity would teach that we worship the Lord Jesus Christ and Him only. Nothing else, nobody else. And the New Testament does say that as we worship Him, as we behold Him in the Word of God, 2 Corinthians 3, as we're studying Him, as we're thinking about Him, we will become like Him. If we're worshiping Jesus, we will, over time, gradually become like Him. If you worship something else, whatever that thing is, you're going to become it. And so there is a great principle there. Questions or comments before we shut down this morning? Let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for time together. We ask your blessing upon the morning service, that the Lord Jesus would be honored and that we would be edified. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.